Alrighty, well, welcome everyone to our Experiences Writing Workshop. This is a part of our Preparing to Apply series, so there are other workshops for you to join. You can always head on over to the HPA website. And Joanne is going to be in the chat hanging out with us to answer any questions, and she might even be like, oh, this is a really good question, Karen, can we address it as a group? And we'll definitely be doing that. So any questions you have, again, please feel free to type it in the chat or even unmute yourself. And I like to start off with experiences writing, kind of talking about, what are we even going to be talking about in the application? So basically every application has an experiences section for you to be writing about all the wonderful things you've been doing in addition to your personal statement. And a lot of times people are worried like, oh, am I doing enough? Am I doing the right things? In my experience, a lot of our Davis students are a part of like a lot of clubs. Maybe they're even working, maybe that's at Target or maybe it's doing research. Usually they're a part of student-run clubs on campus or even off campus sometimes, and all of that will count. All of that can be in your application. And today I'm going to be going over like the logistics of, well, how do we actually fill out the application? And conceptually, what is our goal for the experiences section? And considering that, how do we actually write the application portion? So I do like to give a really big overview, and we'll be talking more about the logistics later, but in AMCAS, so for our pre-meds here today, and actually, I forgot to ask earlier, can you please feel free to type in the chat, what health profession are you interested in today? So that way I can also gauge better, how do we go about the rest of this presentation? Optometry, MD, DO, MD, vet med, wonderful. Occupational therapy. Ooh, a couple of occupational therapy. Great. Nursing. Okay, so going back to this, for our pre-meds who are applying to MD schools, you have a max of 15 experiences. You'll have 700 characters per experience to write, and that will be including spaces. In addition to that, you'll have 3 meaningful experiences, and you get an additional 1,325 characters. As a separate box. And we'll be talking more about how to write that. For all the other CASs, whether you're applying to DO school, PA school, optometry school, etc., that's going to be in this other box. You have an unlimited number of experiences, but you are limited to 600 characters each. From here, people usually say, well, how many should I have? And it's kind of up to you and how you've been spending your time and things like that. In general, people tend to have around 10 to 15. That's pretty normal. But then also, like if you have more than that and you're in the other CASs section, you can have more, 20, 25, etc. But we want to think about, well, how much time will the readers have to actually read this? So around 20 is a good maximum, 25 or so. And we're not thinking about like, oh, if I have 10 experiences, I'm golden. No, we want to think about in general, what is the goal of the experiences section? We're not using this to check off boxes in general, but we'll kind of talk more about that later. I also like to highlight, well, how many characters do we have for experiences writing versus how many do we have for the personal statement in total? So in the chat, please feel free to type in how many characters you'll have for your personal statement. 5,300, yep, that's what you'll have for MD and DO. 5,300. If you're applying to some other programs, it's usually around 3,000 characters, upwards of 4,500 characters. From here, it kind of just depends. But then thinking about, okay, if we were to think about the experiences section alone, and let's just say we were just doing 10 experiences and we only had 600 characters, that means right there alone, we already have 6,000 characters, and that's already more technically than the personal statement. So we have to be considering, we have a lot of space here. And so a lot of times people want to run in and jump January, personal statement, let's go. That's great, but we can't neglect the experiences section. There's so many characters for you to have to write, but not only that, it's going to take time to write that. And also there's a lot of logistical information that we have to keep track of that we'll talk about later that we'll also need to get, and that takes up a lot of time too. So that's why we're talking about experiences right now. We want to get going on this writing and not neglect it and realize, oh shoot, I'm kind of running out of time, or it's taking longer than I expected. Okay. So why is there an experiences section in your application? What are schools using this for? And feel free to type in the chat or unmute. And Joanne, of course, if you have anything to add throughout this presentation, of course, please chime in.
Will do, but you're doing great.
Well, thanks. To assess core competencies. Yes, that's a pretty big piece. Any other statements? Anyone else want to put out any other thoughts? Okay. Experiences are the tools in your application. Remember, we're trying to show schools who you are and what value do you bring. And so experiences are a way for us to do that. So for example, if you plan on talking about in your personal statement, I want to be able to serve underserved communities, such as maybe those experiencing homelessness, or even maybe cultural or ethnic identities like the Latinx community and things like that. We can use experiences to show you've already done that. Maybe you were at a clinic, like a student-run clinic, or maybe you're doing other activities and you were able to work with these populations. We can show in your experiences writing what you learned and gained from that experience. We can be very strategic and show them things like that. And I think just in general, we're going to be using these ideas to help base the rest of our writing. And even when we're choosing categories and things like that for the different experiences types. So a lot of times people are wondering what counts and when. So basically everything since the summer after high school will probably be in your application. So maybe you started working a job over the summer at like McDonald's or Target or wherever. That can definitely be going into your application, and it should. Maybe you've been a part of student-run clubs. Again, anything and everything since that point can go in there. A lot of times people ask, well, I started shadowing in high school and I continued in throughout college with the same doctor. That can definitely make sense. We can definitely include that experience. But sometimes people start asking about like clubs and stuff that they're doing in high school, but you've probably been doing other things here in college that we'd probably want to focus more on instead. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions on what counts or when, or is this making sense? And this is the audience participation portion of the event. So I want to make sure that you all understand before we move on to the next topic.
So I have a question actually. So I did shadowing in high school that was like pretty impactful as to like how I view medicine. Can I still include it even though it happened during high school? Yeah,
great question. And Joanne, feel free to chime in after if you have additional thoughts, but because you said the word impactful, I feel like that makes a lot of sense for us to want to include that.
Cool, thank you.
If you shadow multiple doctors, do you chunk the hours together? Great question. You can, maybe if you're applying, to med school and you only have those 15 and we're trying to conserve the number of spots we have, it can make sense to chunk all of those together and highlight different things that you got. If you have that space and you realize, hey, this one doctor, I focus on this one competency or explore this one piece of medicine that's really important to me, we could theoretically separate that out and kind of chunk all the other doctors together too. It's kind of up to you at this point and strategically using as much space that we have as we can, basically. Can we list virtual experiences that we may have done since COVID? Yes, you can. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay, these are some pretty popular experiences. And obviously these are not all the experiences. I'm sure there's millions and bajillions of things that you could be doing that's not on this list, but in general, this is what a lot of our students do and can definitely be going into your application. And you might have even noticed something you might not have expected. I did write out the word hobbies here. Anyone have any guesses on why I might have placed hobbies here? And Kimberly, I'll definitely get to your question, but I'm hoping people will answer this question first, and I'll definitely get to it. Yeah, thank you, Madeline. So some people are saying hobbies show commitment, you're well-rounded. It's one way to show that you're doing things outside of academics. Yes. Get to know you more. Definitely yes. To get a sense of what you're doing in your free time. Yes, all of this makes sense. When you think about it, you have to be able to explain and show who you are beyond wanting to go into medicine or OT or nursing, et cetera. They're wanting to know who you are. And oftentimes that has to do with all the other things that you're doing with your spare time. So for example, I've seen people talk about like maybe they're really into like working out. And yes, that's a hobby, but how can we actually expand that and take that to the next level? For example, maybe they're doing CrossFit, or maybe they're training to do like marathons, or maybe they're training on, a triathlon or something bigger than what we're talking about. Because we kind of have to be careful between saying things that we have to do as like humans, like sometimes people say like cooking, exercising, etc. That's kind of something everyone should do, versus how can we take that a step further? So maybe you are baking, and maybe you take that a step further and decide, hey, I want to teach baking classes on Zoom for children who are maybe, they need some extra help because their parents are working all the time. Or maybe you're using that time to spend with the elderly population, etc. I'm going to just go through the chat real quick. Oh, I see Joanne answered Kimberly's question. Great. Sorry, I'm just reading the questions.
Can I follow up on Alexandra's question?
Yeah.
So if you rode horses throughout your life and you took lessons in college, I would count that as a hobby, even if as long as you did it into college. It sounds like you haven't done it for a couple of years, so you would want to show the longevity of your horse riding throughout your life. So you can start it prior to college and then show that it went into college.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that kind of connects back to what someone said in the chat earlier, like using this also is like how you de-stress, or maybe you realize this is what you can do in your spare time, because any health professional school program is going to be stressful. And we have to be able to show these schools, hey, I'm ready to take that on. This is what I have as like a coping mechanism in a way. And I know Cynthia had a question. If I'm both secretary and pharmacy co-head, would that be okay to put as two separate experiences, or should I make it into one most meaningful experience? And that's kind of up to you. If you feel like you have two very different things to say about them, I say it can make sense to actually split them up. But if it feels like there's a lot of overlap, or you're okay putting it together with the amount of characters that you have, that makes sense too. And really, you're only going to know unless you try it out first, in my opinion. So feel free to try and write it out as two separate experiences. And if, again, it sounds like there's a lot of overlap, we can actually start combining if needed. Okay. So now if we're talking about in the application, again, we're going to have to do a little bit of back and forth to kind of talk about concepts and like how to actually do it in the application. So these are all the questions that they ask you no matter what application system we're in. They're going to ask you what the experience type is. And I'm going to go over those different types of categories in just a little bit because there's so many different types. They're going to ask for the organization. And so they're going to need a name and an address. And they're also going to ask for like a supervisor. So a name of a person, their title, and their contact information. So let's say, for example, you're like in a club, the club name would be the organization, the address would be like the UC Davis address, and your supervisor name, that's something you'll actually have to figure out with your members during the application cycle. You want to have just really one name that everyone can put in the application. And in that case, if you have an advisor for that club, it can make sense to put their name. If you don't, have an adult to put on the application because maybe it's entirely student run, at this point, we'd want to consider, maybe we can ask an HPA advisor to put their name as like just a supervisor contact in that scenario. And I know sometimes people have questions on that, so I'm going to pause in case Joanne wants to add anything on that. I know frequently Joanne has put her name on things, but again, we just have to ask and figure that out.
Yeah, I don't mind as long as everybody in the club agrees to put the same person.
Okay. Moving on from that, you will also have to list the experience dates that you have done that experience. In AMCAS, I believe you're allowed to have 3 or 4 separate dates. And with nitty-gritty stuff like this, application systems actually release a guide for you to read. They're usually like 50 to like 80 pages or so. And so you're gonna have to download it. And it's a chunky read, but it'll be worth it, I promise, to read the nitty-gritty stuff like that. But going back to, usually AMCAS gives you like 3 or 4 dates. So maybe you did it like 3 or 4 summers in a row. AMCAS is pretty nice and they let you select those dates. For other ones, you're just going to be using your best judgment. And they'll also be asking a total number of weeks you did that experience and how many hours per week you did it. And so that way the application system will figure out in total how many hours you did. And that's probably going to take a lot of time. I know a lot of times you're going to be going back into your emails and figuring out, well, who did invite me to this? Maybe you went to a conference or an online event. Who invited me? What organization name do I put? What were the dates and the times and stuff? So you really want to get that going because that research does take a long time. I heard that dates sometimes get cut off. Can you explain what you mean, Alex? Not too sure.
Yeah, I was watching I think Dr. Ryan Gray hosts like the pre-med years or something like that. And I think he was saying that sometimes if you break up the dates into like August to September this year and stuff like that, sometimes they can only see the first line, but I'm not too sure.
Yeah, I can say in general for AMCAS, you can project out future dates. For other application systems, you have until the day that you submit to put the dates or the number of hours that you have. But Joanne, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Alexandra, if you're talking about the words literally getting cut off in the application. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I've never heard of that. I used to look at a lot of AMCAS applications and I don't recall that being an issue. So it's possible that he's heard of it, but it's not so prevalent that it's widely known because I've been doing med school apps for 10 years and have never heard of that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I haven't heard of that either. Again, that's why I asked. But again, just to reiterate, for AMCAS, we can project out hours into the future past the submit date. But for all other application systems, we have until the day that we submit to include hours. We did have another question in the chat. What if it's not consistent weekly hours? We just want to do our best and like average it out. That way we can get the total number of hours to be as correct and honest as possible to what you've been doing and how you spent that time. Another question that they will ask you is, do you release authorization for them to contact the supervisor if they have any questions? And we are going to say yes, but I will say the majority of the time, they do not have the time to do that. Let's just think logistically. Even if you only put 10 experiences and supervisors, you're one applicant, that'd already be 10 people to contact. Now, let's say they receive, just in general, throwing out a number like 5,000. That'd be like 50,000 people to contact. They really don't have time to do that. So it's going to be okay if you haven't talked to that person in a while. It's really going to be okay. We just need to fill it out for the application. And on the flip side, experiences details, you're going to be giving the title. So what was your title? What was your role? What were you doing? What type of experience was it? Were you paid? Were you a volunteer? Did you receive academic credit? And again, the logistics, average weekly hours, number of weeks. And then you're going to have that character space to do things. And we'll kind of talk about that in a little bit. But any other questions to wrap up the logistics side of the application? Would caregivers be considered as clinical? And I think this becomes a little important to ask, well, who were you a caregiver for? Or like, how extensive was your role? So Kathleen, do you mind adding on like who you were caregiving for? Like, was this a paid position or what was going on?
Yeah, this is a paid position, but then it's like a residential facility, so it's not like medical facility.
Okay. To me, that kind of sounds like it would be like a paid experience. And if you wanted it to be clinical, it could be. But what are your thoughts on that, Joanne?
I think that I've never heard of a school that requires quote clinical work in the sense that unless it's PA, are you pre-PA?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's different. Then what I would do is ask every PA school that so send one email to multiple PA schools and ask the schools if they plan to, or if they would count caregiving as a clinical experience, or would they count those hours towards the clinical hours? Because the answer to that question is going to vary drastically by school. And you want to have that in writing that they will or won't take it, so that you know which schools to apply to and which ones to avoid. And then if you go to apply and then they were to say anything about it, you have it in writing that they said they would take it. I would always document them ahead of time before submitting your application.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes, a very good point. So some of these, as you know, you notice pre-PA students, they will need hands-on clinical experience to reach the minimum hours for the schools they're applying to. So there will be slight differences for like that across the professions. I'm so glad that we asked if Kathleen was pre-PA. If you took a course that involves volunteering or an internship, do we need to mention that it was a course? Great question. And there's technically a rule that you're not supposed to like double dip like that if you received academic credit. However, for the most part, pretty much everyone does that. So let's say, for example, you did do, for example, just like the student run clinic, you have to take that course every quarter to supplement that, but you would still be able to write about your clinical experience in the experiences section. We're just really not drawing attention to the fact that you received academic credit usually. But I am curious, what volunteering or what internship did you do? That we can talk more about that.
So this quarter, I'm participating in the EVE 198 COVID-19 testing program, and I volunteer about 3 or 6 hours every week, but I only get 2 units for the course. So I'm not really sure if it's really enough to count, because it's much more volunteering than a 2-unit course would typically have as a workload. So I'm thinking of just counting it as volunteering and not mentioning the course. I don't get, that credit doesn't count for anything for me anyway. I'm not counting it for GEs or anything.
Great question. Yeah. And so it would still be in your transcript. You will be listing it out as, you know, that 2-unit pass, no pass course. But in the experiences section, you're focusing on what did you learn as a volunteer? What did you do, etc. So that can still go in your application.
Okay, thank you.
Someone had a question about, you know, they've been tutoring for quite a while. They're wondering, should they separate that out as an experience because they were paid before and now, or I mean, they were a volunteer before and now they're being paid. You can separate out that experience if you want to. That way it can count towards volunteer hours. And the reason why I'm kind of bringing that up is because if you are pre-med or even pre-dental, there are some schools that can screen on the number of volunteer hours that you do have. And so it can be beneficial to move some of those hours to volunteer since it was volunteered versus ones that you were paid. That can make sense. But from there, you know, we can always talk about should things be lumped up or not. Alrighty, going back to that overview, like I mentioned before, AMCAS has you do 15 experiences, the others are unlimited. You have 700 characters for AMCAS, 600 for all the others. I do like to point out for our pre-vets, you can now start up to the 5 most meaningful. It doesn't give you additional characters. However, when they do have that front page report, they do include those 5 most meaningful experiences that you chose. For ADSAS, you can have 6. And just a fun tidbit, diecast actually gives you 1,500 characters per experience slot. Okay, and again, we're thinking of experiences as tools in our writing. So what do you want the reader to understand or learn about you from this experience? We need to be considering, why did you choose to do that experience? What did you learn from that? How did you grow? What core competencies can we focus on? We're thinking about this in a strategic way. So for example, if you feel like you developed your oral communication skills in so many different experiences, we can actually just really choose one experience to highlight that in, because maybe that was the first time and you feel like you grew the most from that. And all those other experiences become open to talking about other things that you learned from that experience. So Alex had a question. I volunteered for Planned Parenthood this past election cycle to encourage people to vote for Congress elections. Should I be cautious when listing that? I think that's a pretty good question. And again, we don't necessarily have to focus too much on what you did. We can think about what you learned, because I know politics has been very divisive lately. But Joanne, did you have anything to add to that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? Oh, volunteering for Planned Parenthood.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that there's anything wrong with volunteering for Planned Parenthood. I think it's a really common thing to do. That I wouldn't worry about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is the experience types that I was talking about before. AMCAS, very extensive as always, actually has 18 for you to choose from. And so you're going to want to be thinking, well, how do I want to select it out? And usually it's not too big of a deal. You're using your best judgment for what you want to choose and focus on, basically. But the only exception, like I mentioned before, is there are some schools that do screen out based on volunteer hours. So let's say, for example, you're working in a student-run clinic. Not all of those hours have to count towards clinical hours or something like that, because we can actually split up those hours into doing different things, as long as we're not double dipping the number of hours. So for example, if we do split experiences like that, doesn't mean they get counted towards both. They only get counted towards one. And sometimes people are worried, well, do I have to use every one of these? And the answer is no. If you didn't do research, I don't expect you to squeeze something and make it into research when it wasn't. They're not thinking about it like that. You just really choose the ones that best fit with what you're trying to say. But in general, since not everyone here is pre-med, of course, here's in general topics and types for you to choose from. There are more, and so it will definitely depend on the profession that you're considering. Again, you would just be checking that guide, or even when the application opens, it'll show you the different options there. But in general, this is what we're looking at. And I did underline the health profession or health career experience because we do have to distinguish this, especially for our pre-PA folks. You would want to be listing things under those patient care experience hours, definitely when possible, in order to meet minimums as needed. Any other thoughts or questions on categorizing? Is volunteer hours the only one schools could screen for? That's a great question. And I think that's going to be dependent on a school. If a school wants to screen on something for the number of hours, they can. Have I really heard of it? No. Yeah.
I had another
Joanne
quick,
answered it. Oh, go ahead.
sorry, I had another quick question. Could you go over the difference between health profession, healthcare experience, and patient care experience?
Great question. And what health profession are you applying?
MD.
Okay. Yeah, so patient care experience is when you are like the provider. So you are giving patient care, maybe you're taking vitals or things like that, versus healthcare experience. It kind of just depends on the application system. Maybe if they don't have shadowing as an option, that would consider as part of the healthcare experience. Or maybe you went to an event and they were talking about, them being doctors or things like that. So it kind of depends. And in that, every application system, again, says the different categories that they have, and they have the technical definition to follow.
Okay, so like I did an HRI with the playroom at UCDMC, and I like played with children and like held them and played with them at bedside. Would that count as healthcare experience?
Good question. And Joanne said no in the chat.
Okay, so that'd be volunteering.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So patient care experience is when you are giving patients the care that they need, medically, etc. Okay, now to get to the good stuff, drafting. So I highly encourage you to have some form of Google Doc, keeping track of all this stuff. If Google Sheets makes sense because you're also keeping track of hours, that's definitely great. But I highly encourage Google Docs, at least for the writing portion, because it makes it so much easier for HPA advisors to actually help you edit in a Google Doc versus a Google Sheet. And if we're doing a new draft, I highly encourage making a new Google Doc for it, because then we can keep track of everything. If you're just starting off writing about your experiences, list numbers 1 through, if it's, MD application 15 or, 20 or, whatever, and start listing all the different things that you've been doing since the summer after high school. And then from there, I'd encourage you to start thinking about, well, how do I plan to categorize it? And what do I want to highlight or focus on from this experience? And you can list out many things when you're first starting this off, though you can actually compare it to all the other things that you've been doing. And again, that's where you can really realize, hey, I did oral communication for all these different things. Maybe I just focus it and talk about it in one, and then that way I can focus on different things in the other writings. And you can split up and combine experiences. Let's say, for example, you started off in a student-run clinic. Maybe you started off as a general intern, and then maybe after like your second year, you became secretary. Maybe after that, you were like chair for like patient advocacy or things like that. You can split it up, because then you have 600 characters per thing to talk about. But again, if you feel like there's a lot of overlap, maybe between the first 2 years, that could potentially be lumped together in that third year when you were doing something else. We can separate out and have more space to talk about. Again, we just don't want to double dip hours like that. And we probably don't want to be splitting up every experience you've been doing. A few of them would probably make sense. And again, if you have questions on that, we can always talk about that during the one-on-one appointment. And again, I highly, highly encourage you to start tracking all of this stuff now, because I think it always takes longer than anticipated. Formatting, again, we do have to include spaces. You can't indent, bold, italic, etc. And then thinking about, do you want to use I statements, very common, or do you want to use it more like resume style and like just use like the verb, like you organized or dedicated time, etc., etc. Just be consistent with whatever you choose. That makes a lot more sense. And it's up to you if you want to use sentence or bullets. I think you can do both. I think it can be a little bit harder with bullets, but whatever makes sense for your brain. Ultimately, everyone's working towards the same goal of being able to include both what you did and some piece of a reflection on what you learned or what you want them to know about you, etc. Before you submit, you want to be able to copy and paste it into plain text and then into an application that's clear of all text, like Microsoft Notepad or Mac Text Edit, because there is some type of coding in like Google Doc and stuff like that that can show up as really weird characters in the other side for the readers that they would have. And AMCAS does say to do that, and in general, that's just good for all application systems. And before we get to writing or looking at an example, I like to point out some do's. Again, we're thinking strategically about what do we want the reader to know about you? What are we focusing on and highlighting? What reflection, how did you change, core competencies, things like that. And in AMCAS, when we have those 700 characters, we still want to include all of that, even when you decide to make it a most meaningful experience. Even with those additional 1,300 characters, we actually need to focus on the prompt being, how did this change you? So we still want to include some reflection in that initial 700 characters, but then focus on how did you change in those additional characters. A lot of times, we want to be able to avoid cliches and filler phrases. So for example, a lot of times I see this solidified my desire to be a doctor or OT, etc. But did it really solidify your desire? Didn't you already know you wanted to do that before? I think a lot of times that can just be filler because maybe you don't know what to say. And again, we want to go back to thinking about what is our goal for that experience to explain about you. Sometimes people want to list every technical thing that you did, but again, what you did isn't the special part because a lot of people would have been a TA or a research assistant or shadowed, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many people before you and in that cycle that have done that. That's not what makes you special. What makes you special is what did you take away from this? How does this connect to who you are or your goals in healthcare? What do you want me to learn about you? How does this connect to everything else that we're talking about? So that's why we want to have space for that reflection because that's what makes you special. And we can actually, characters are currency, characters are always limited, and we're really always battling against character count. So we want to repeat information as little as possible. For example, we just listed how, like, the dates that you did it from, so we don't actually have to say it again. Or if you said your title before, we technically don't have to say it again. The exception could be, oh, I was working for this clinic, but instead of like focusing on the clinic name, we can actually kind of expand on, well, who did this clinic serve? That's not always indicative from the name. A lot of times I see students say, oh, I learned so much from this experience, or it changed me so much from this experience. And then everyone at HPA, when we're helping you, right, we're going to try and push you further and think about, well, how did this change you? What did you learn from this experience? We want to be able to connect what you did with that argument that you're making. Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions on this?
I was wondering if when we're writing these, you should be like directly saying what you learned, or it should be in like story format.
Great question. You might not have too much space to do story format. If you can swing it, I say go ahead, but really we're going against characters. So we can say, I was able to develop my teamwork skills because I had to like host weekly meetings with our members. I had to coordinate who did what and delegate, or even have check-ins with people, et cetera, et cetera. So we can connect what you learned with what you did with the evidence or what you did directly.
Okay.
Okay, are we all ready to see an example or any other thoughts or questions? Okay, I take it we are ready for an example. So feel free to take a moment to read this. And then after that, I want to know your thoughts on where are things that can be improved. And if you recognize this, I did snag this from one of Joanne's presentations. So if it looks familiar, that's okay. Alrighty. What are your thoughts on this? Feel free to unmute or type in the chat. Yeah, that's true. They didn't really say what they learned. Let's kind of go from the beginning. What are some things that we probably didn't have to say? Feels kind of surface level. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, they already said they were a health educator. They already had to select the dates. So, you know, you didn't have to say that you spent 2 years doing that. And then I think underserved population, definitely a big keyword, but you know, what does that actually mean? We can actually start naming populations specifically in terms of who they served. We made a huge impact on the community. What do you all think about that? And I see Alex said it can be problematic. And it is kind of vague. Yeah, not sure what the impact is. Who did they maybe actually impact? If it's not the community. Patients. So yeah, like individual people, right? I'm sure they could have impacted, but we don't really get to hear how they impacted them because they didn't explain. So that could be something that they could have elaborated more on. They say that they were so busy they had to turn people away. That sounds kind of sad. We probably wouldn't want to highlight that too much. And thinking about how many people the clinics serve as well. You work alongside doctors, PAs, and med students. Yeah, I mean, you're at a medical clinic. That sounds pretty normal. And then again, it solidified their desire. Again, you know, there are a lot of things where we can push past a lot of this. And this, again, probably a first draft. So now looking at another example, feel free to take a read and letting me know your thoughts. How does this one make you feel? How is this different? Sad. Okay, well, thinking about sadness isn't necessarily the main part. They did bring up, you know, something that's not the best, but they're thinking about, well, what can they do about it? Basically, what did they learn? It is more reflective. And so we have to be careful. We don't want to like say all the negative things about healthcare or all the bad things. Instead, we can kind of focus on what do you hope to do? I don't think changing the system is necessarily a red flag if we're doing it in the right way. Because you're not alone, you wouldn't be able to fix huge systemic problems, but how can you individually focus on changing things? So for example, this person says that they want to work with people and individually help people. And Joanne mentioned in the comments, this person got into multiple UCs. She's currently a med student at UCSD. So it's not necessarily wrong, again, to point out bad things. We want to instead kind of focus more on how can we help. And this person has already addressed how they are, you know, serving as a medical Spanish interpreter. They realize what things that they can do to help the underserved populations. How is this writing style different than the personal statement? It seems like this would be in their personal statement. I wouldn't be surprised if it was, because of how important this probably sounds to them. But the personal statement gives a lot more space to connect back to medicine and why it's important to them. If they hadn't talked about this in the personal statement, that's okay too. Again, I think this might feel a little different because this does include so much more reflection than what you might be used to thinking about the experiences section to be.
I can chime in on Madeline's question. I think that's an oversimplification of what the personal statement is doing. The personal statement is not just an overall reflection, it's sort of making a case for yourself about why you need a seat at that school. So you're showing them why they should accept you. And your reflections, your depth, your insight is one of the reasons why they should accept you. So the more reflection and depth you have about problems that you want to solve in your future and the value that you bring to healthcare, the more likely they'll want you. They really like reflective people. The difference between the second experience writing that you saw compared to the first one is the first one was a lot more focused on what I would call like bragging, right? It was they were definitely trying to make themselves and the clinic sound really important because they were focused on the experience. The second one is not about the experience, but rather what the person took away from the experience. So it was more about the person in the sense that this is what she learned from it. And, you know, if they were looking only at who got to do the coolest experiences and they only accepted people who did the best experiences, which is what a lot of pre-health students think is like, I've got to get the best and the most competitive and the coolest sounding experiences so I can brag about the technical things that I did. Then I think it'd be very hard to stand out in this process because you're competing against a national pool of people who've done all kinds of really cool things. But instead of focusing on the actual experience, if you focus on what you took away from it, that's what you bring to the table. You don't get to take your clinic with you to med school. You have to bring what's in your head to med school. So it'd be much better to show your reflection about what you took away from the experience because that's what they're looking for is, what did this person learn? They can teach you all the technical skills. They can teach you how to take blood pressure. They can teach you how to take a history. What they can't do is teach you how to think.
Thanks, Joanne. Yeah, and if you haven't already, I know we've talked about this in the applicant listserv before, but please Google the AAMC core competencies. I know it says for entering pre-meds, we're just going to pretend it says, for all pre-health professions because the skills listed there are applicable to all of them. And again, like Joanne said, they're there to teach you, what are the different diseases, how do you diagnose, and things like that. What they don't have time to teach you are those core competencies. How do you work with others? What are your teamwork skills like? How do you reflect and critically think to problem solve? What are your oral communication skills? Can you talk to groups of people? Can you talk to groups of patients? Can you be with people who are different than you? That's what you have to show them and prove to them. You have to show them the value that you're bringing. Yeah, a lot of people are always concerned about the overlap between your personal statement and experiences. And that's why starting early will help. And also, talking with HPA advisors. We want to help you throughout this entire process and we can help you with stuff like this. You're not alone. I don't expect it to be perfect when you come bring it because that's why we're meeting, right? This is hard. This will take a lot of energy and work, but that's why we're working on it together. All righty, and I'm gonna be mindful of our time. I know usually I just talk on forever, so I'm so proud of myself for finishing basically a minute early. I do just wanna say again, we have all of these great things for you to reach out to. We do have drop-ins. Next drop-in section is actually right now at 1 to 2 p.m. If you head on over to the HPA website, you can click on the Zoom link. Happy to continue individual conversations there. If you have big picture questions right now, feel free to unmute or type it in the chat. But thank you, everyone.